All right, let's dive into Giles' book, Russia's War on Everybody. Now, this is a really provocative work. It basically argues that all these things we see as separate incidents, cyber attacks, assassinations, disinformation campaigns, they're not random. He says they're actually calculated moves in one single, undeclared global conflict. So we're going to unpack that argument and see why Giles thinks we are all on the front line of a war we might not even realize is happening.
And I mean, wow. Right from the dedication, you can tell this is going to be intense. The author just throws down the gauntlet. This is not your standard academic intro, it's a direct, almost searing challenge. It just immediately signals that this book is not going to pull any punches. It frames the whole thing not just as commentary, but as a really urgent warning.
Okay, so to really get to the heart of this thing, we've broken our explainer down into 4 parts. First up, we'll get into why this book even exists. Then, we're going to map out the structure of Russia's strategy as Giles lays it out. After that, we'll zoom in on 3 absolutely crucial takeaways. And to wrap it all up, we'll take a balanced look at the book's biggest strengths and, of course, its limitations.
So let's kick things off with that really big question. I mean, right now, all the media coverage is focused on the very real conventional war in Ukraine. So why write a book with a title this huge? Why a war on everybody?
Yeah, that title is a really bold claim, isn't it? It's basically saying the fight isn't just happening in trenches and on battlefields, it's happening everywhere, all the time. And the targets? Well, the title says it all. It's all of us. So what's the logic behind such a massive assertion?
Well, the book's main goal is to put together a jigsaw puzzle that most of us only ever see in scattered pieces. Giles is arguing that all these events we read about is separate stories, a cyber attack on a hospital here, a disinformation campaign there, a political assassination on foreign soil. They're not random. He says they are all connected parts of a single, coherent, and ongoing strategy. The whole point of the book is to give us the frame to see that big picture and to show how this invisible fight impacts not just governments, but businesses, societies, and regular people.
Okay, so to make that case, Giles structures his book really deliberately. To really get his whole argument about a global war, we first need to see how he builds his case, step by step. Let's look at the logical flow he uses.
The book follows this really clear 4-part journey that takes you from the big, abstract ideas right down to the deeply personal. It starts with the why, digging into the worldview and historical grievances that Giles says are driving Russian state action. From there, it moves to the how, and it catalogs this huge toolkit of hostile measures, everything from overt military force to covert political meddling. Then it looks at the who, uncovering a network of enablers that goes way beyond state agents to include Western professionals and even organized crime. And then finally, it brings it all home with the most important question. So what? It details what this nonstop conflict actually means for you, the individual citizen.
All right, now we're getting to the real heart of the book's argument. We've gone through and distilled the author's entire analysis into what we think are the 3 most essential takeaways. These are the big ideas you absolutely have to grasp to understand his central point.
Let's jump into that first key insight. This is a really foundational concept, and it goes directly against a core Western idea about how countries are supposed to act with each other. This might just be the most critical point in the entire book. See, from a Western point of view, war and peace are 2 separate things. They're like a light switch, either on or off. Giles argues that for Russia, that line doesn't exist. It's meaningless. Instead, conflict is permanent. It's a constant condition, and it's just waged at different levels of intensity. The only thing that ever changes is which tools they're using at any given moment.
And this quote from a European counterintelligence officer just nails the point. It's pretty startling. He's saying that actions we would see as a massive escalation. I'm talking about things like targeted assassinations, industrial sabotage inside NATO territory like that ammunition depot explosion in the Czech Republic, or huge election interference campaigns. Moscow doesn't see those as steps towards war. In their playbook, those are just normal, totally acceptable tools of statecraft during what we would call peacetime.
Okay, so the second takeaway builds right on top of that idea of a permanent, undeclared conflict. It pinpoints one of the main battlefields where this war is being fought, and it's a battlefield that involves every single one of us every day.
The book argues that in this whole-of-society war, information isn't just a tool to help the military. No, information warfare is the goal. The real strategy is to shape how you see the world, to erode your trust in democratic institutions, to make social divisions even worse, and ultimately, to create this cynical apathy where people feel like objective truth is impossible and all sides are just as bad as each other. It's about paralyzing a society's will to even respond.
You know, what's so interesting here is that this isn't just a TV schedule, it's a weapon schedule. An interviewee in the book calls the weekend domestic propaganda lineup a heavy bombardment. He even compares it to George Orwell's 2 Minutes Hate, but says this goes on for hours across a bunch of different channels. This constant barrage isn't about informing anyone. It's engineered to indoctrinate, to build and maintain an alternate reality, and to keep people in a permanent state of psychological war against perceived enemies.
So that brings us to our third and final key takeaway. If information is the battlefield, then this next point defines who the soldiers are. And the answer is directly tied to the book's really provocative title. So if the conflict never stops and information is a key battleground, who's actually on the front line? Well, the book's answer is pretty chilling. Everyone. The strategy Giles describes doesn't make a distinction between soldiers and civilians. The targeting goes way beyond politicians and generals to include journalists, academics, community leaders, business executives, and even the families of military members.
And this slide right here is the proof. It's a sample from a real GRU phishing campaign that's analyzed in the book. The variety of targets here is just shocking, but it's all strategic. You target religious figures to disrupt institutions of moral authority. You go after investigators like Bellingcat to neutralize people who expose what you're doing. Targeting military spouses, that creates psychological pressure and opens up potential vulnerabilities. The key point here is that in this kind of war, nobody is considered too unimportant to be a target or an instrument or just collateral damage.
Okay, so now that we've laid out the book's core arguments, it's really important we step back and analyze the work itself. In this last section, we're going to look at what this book does incredibly well, and then we'll get into some of its limitations, not necessarily as flaws, but as really important context for anyone who reads it.
Yeah, a good critical read means looking at both sides of the coin. So first, let's break down the book's biggest strengths, the things that make it such a compelling and important piece of work.
Without a doubt, the book's greatest strength is how it connects the dots. It takes dozens of events that seem totally unrelated, the Salisbury poisonings, cyber attacks on the German parliament, funding for fringe political groups, mysterious explosions at weapons depots, and it weaves them all into one single, understandable story. It gives you a powerful framework that lets you see a consistent pattern of behavior where you might have just seen chaos before. Another huge strength is that it's so focused on people. As this quote from the author himself shows, this isn't just some high-level geopolitical theory. Giles grounds his arguments in tons of interviews with the actual diplomats, soldiers, journalists, and activists who have found themselves on this invisible front line. And these personal stories, they turn abstract ideas like hybrid warfare into real, tangible experiences. It makes the threat feel immediate.
Okay, now let's talk about the limitations, which are just as important to understand. First, the analysis is, without a doubt, coming from a Western and specifically European security viewpoint. It explains Russian actions as they're seen from the outside, but it doesn't really dig deep into alternative interpretations or the internal Russian worldview on its own terms. Second, its power really comes from these compelling case studies. Now that's really effective, but it means the argument is built on powerful anecdotes instead of large-scale data, which is a totally valid choice, but it does leave it open to criticism of cherry-picking. And finally, while the book is brilliant at explaining the problem, it's way less focused on giving a detailed step-by-step policy plan for how to fix it.
And that leads perfectly to the book's final call to action. Because the problem is defined as a whole-of-society conflict, the only real solution has to be a whole-of-society defense. Giles argues that if everyone is a target, then everyone has a part to play in being resilient. This totally shifts the burden of national security. It's not just the job of governments and armies anymore. It now includes things like corporate cybersecurity, media literacy in schools, and just a critical thinking of every single citizen.
And so, we're left with the book's central and, I think, really provocative question. If Keir Giles is right, and the battlefield isn't a physical place but a state of mind that weaves through our daily lives, through the news we read and the institutions we trust, what does that actually mean for each of us? The book really forces you to think about what your personal frontline looks like, and what it even means to defend it.